Well, welcome. Glad to be back here. I've been to a number of Agile India events, starting I think in 2014, and was happy to be involved in being the conference chair one year, which was fun to work with Naresh on that. So good to be back. And when Naresh said this would be the final one, I said, well, I've got to be here. So it's good. It's always enjoyable. Today I'm going to talk about managed evolutionary change. I think I have to. All right, I'll just keep being active here. So managed evolutionary change, it's a fundamental element of the Kanban method. And I could do this entire talk without talking about Kanban at all, but I will talk about Kanban because Kanban is much more than people think it is. People think they're using Kanban because they see it in Jira, they see a Kanban board in Jira, so therefore they must be using Kanban. And that's a piece of it. It's a great part of it. The visual board is an excellent part of the Kanban method. The Kanban method is much more than that. And the evolutionary change is really part of the foundation of it. You're starting with what you do now and getting really good at continuously improving through evolutionary change. But people don't know how to do that necessarily, and that's what I'm going to try to help you understand is how do we go about being successful with evolutionary change. There's me. I've been involved in the Agile community for quite some time, as I said, and now at first it was just a side gig as I was being an executive within both an oil company and a data company, and then eventually decided, well, okay, I'll join this since I was doing the agility sort of as a means to do my day job. Eventually ended up doing it full time as chairman of Kanban University. What we've seen from Agile transformations, just notional, is lots of different outcomes. You could have a few cases where Agile has worked for us and we continue to get better. That's great. They figured it out. And likely they've actually figured out evolutionary change by continuing to get better. But frequently what we see, maybe they get a little bit of benefit, but it hasn't gotten much better lately. We see Agile has been a total disaster. They came in and didn't do anything for it. Or the last one, it really didn't help, but it really didn't hurt either, right? And all of these happen, right? And I think we all see them. And the challenge is that there's far too many of these and these, I would say. And even Jeff Sutherland, the founder of Scrum, one of the co-founders of Scrum, is quoted as saying 58% of Scrum implementations are late, over budget, with unhappy customers, right? This is what we have set the world up for. This is what the reality of how things are working. People are doing this thing that we also see some great benefit from, but most people aren't getting it. Right? A lot of people are not getting the benefit, and we continue to do it. And this is really the source of the frustration, I think, that we're seeing, and the reason why, as Scott said, the Agile community shat the bed. They went out and they sort of strip mined the concepts and tried selling the concepts without actually delivering results. And this is, I think, the key is where evolutionary change is important, is because this is the only way you keep getting better. All right. So part of the problem here is this whole concept of transformation, right? This thing that we're going to do an Agile transformation. Well, in an Agile transformation, we're already starting from a very traditional concept. We heard the name McKinsey mentioned this morning by Bjarte. Well, transformation was something he also brought along. This concept that we're going to identify some future state. We've got some current process, and we've got some future state we want to get to. I was involved in a McKinsey involvement in a company I was at. And so I understand the McKinsey process very well as a part of it. And they always start with you've got to get to this future state. And here's how we're going to design that future state. And that's going to be your big transformation. You got to transform, and it's wonderful. And we fell in love with transformations too. At the same time we're falling in love with Agile, we're also falling in love with digital transformations. I went to one company, had 4 transformations at least going on at the same time. Just a love affair, none of them being successful really, but 4 of them in action. Yeah, and eventually they got a new CEO who created new ones, right? So, but the problem with this transformation concept is this future process is designed in advance. Right? We're going to tell you how you're going to get there, as opposed to really understanding what you currently do and evolving yourself and getting there. So this is fundamentally, if we look at this from an Agile lens, what this is a big design up front problem, right? We've designed this up front, and we're doing exactly what we're telling people not to do from an Agile perspective. What we really want to do, and this is what we emphasize in the Kanban method, is start with what you do now. Right? Understand that, not what you say you do, not what you documented what you do, but what you actually do. Right? Let's figure out what you actually do, because you're doing some things that are working. You might have lots of things not working, but let's really not throw away the things that are working, so let's really understand it before we get started. And then we start to continually evolve that. Right? And we add Kanban practices and principles on top of it. We put the ones that are appropriate at the point you're at. Not installing some framework that has just follow these instructions, right? This guide tells you all these things you have to do. Go install it and, find someone to master it and run with it, right? No, you actually have to use your mind and actually understand what you're currently doing so that you can continually get better. To that extent, Kanban's not a framework, right? Kanban is not a framework in the sense that you install it. Kanban is something that you use to evolve and grow and choose what's right as you go forward. It's a method for improving knowledge work service delivery through evolutionary change. So evolutionary change is humane. Big transformation is not. Right? Big transformation, you're changing, you're almost always what we see with transformations is, what's the thing that always goes with a transformation? The reorganization, right? The reorganization, people get put into new organizational structures. We love these things, transformations and organizations, because it lets us lead, right? We just have a purpose in life to lead and manage. All we're doing is just rearranging the chairs on the Titanic most of the time, right? We're actually not instilling the behavior we really want. So we have two types of evolution. There's Darwinism or gradualism, which is what we typically associate with evolution. And that's where the evolution changes happen steady and gradual through the whole time. And there's also something, though, called punctuated equilibrium. And that's in response to rapidly changing environmental conditions. There's a rapid burst of evolution and changing things in a very short period of time. Now, this can also, punctuated equilibrium can be imposed, in which case, that's what a transformation is doing. A transformation is imposing a punctuated equilibrium. But sometimes punctuated equilibrium comes upon us, right? So in recent times, can you think of some punctuated equilibriums that we've experienced? AI. AI is something that the hype has come around and says, okay, your world is changing, go adapt, right? So that's one. Any others? COVID itself is a punctuated equilibrium. It opened up. Oh, yes. Yeah, so he exposed us to a punctuated equilibrium, right? By changing the thinking about evolution. Yeah, great point. So yes, all of these are things we hit. The other element is push versus pull. Is change being imposed, or is change coming intrinsically? Right? And the Kanban method is all about pull. We want to pull. We want to pull from customers. You want to be pulling things into the system as capacity is available. But change is also something that you want to look at pull. Right? But most of the time, what we're seeing is push-oriented change. Leader says, I want to see a change here, and they're pushing it down. And that tends to look like our Uncle Sam. So Uncle Sam was a character in the US, still around, but particularly big during World War II. It's like, I want you, in case, to do something you wouldn't normally do, which is I want you to join the war. Now it's, I want you, Scott, since you're Canadian, I want Canada. We have people who think like that. Good luck. Yeah, I know. Some people take things too far, and some, yeah, anyway. I have no explanation for any of that. Don't try to. But I want you to do something. I want you to change. And this how well does this work in your organizations when you try to do this, right? Very frustrating, right? Because people do not resist change, they resist being changed. This is a quote by Peter saying, "You get discipline." Yeah, people are okay changing, but they don't want to be told what to change. They don't want their identity structured. If they had been a project manager, they don't want you coming in and say, okay, now you're a Scrum Master, or now you're a product owner, or whatever it is. They had an identity, and that identity got taken away. The Kanban method, we approach it as we start with what you do now, and we honor that. We don't change it until we understand we have to change it. So the change management principles that we have in the Kanban method, and this is the way we really approach evolutionary change, is start with what you do now, agree to pursue evolutionary change, and then have active leadership at all levels. So we start by understanding a joint way of working, and we start improving based on what we see as real. This makes sense. So if we look at this in more practical terms, so understand your current processes as actually practice, respecting existing roles, responsibilities, and job titles. We don't do a reorganization. Reorganization is the last thing we do. We only do that as a last resort. We only change job titles as a last resort. We start with what you do now, evolve it, and if that's the appropriate thing to change, you'll discover that. You decide when that's the right time. Agree to pursue evolutionary change, so only make small changes, only as much as you're comfortable doing. But then, with that, means active leadership, you need to get comfortable being a little bit uncomfortable. Because if you only do what you're comfortable doing, you may not do anything. You might get comfortable being in stasis. You need to get comfortable being a bit uncomfortable. You need to get a sense of continuously improving and figuring out how to get there. So the other part is the evolutionary change formula. And this will look very similar to what Bjarte showed. You've got to start with a stressor. Where's the dissatisfaction? Where's the pain? If you don't have a stressor, you're not going to see change happen. You're not going to see intrinsic change. You're not going to see intrinsic motivation for change. And that's what's really important. Start with understanding where the stress is, where the pain is, and that you get through a reflection mechanism. Could be retrospective, could be whatever. You've got to reflect on it and say, I have this challenge. Let's do something about it. And the act of leadership is that actually doing something about it. So if we look at this in the perspective of David Anderson's Blue Book, the cartoon on this illustrates this, right? The various communications, I'm stuck, I'm too busy, I'm idle, let's do something about it. What we're seeing here is the feedback mechanism. There's a number of feedback mechanisms here. There's the communication, the conversation, the meetings, that's having some communication, that's the feedback mechanism. We're also seeing the board. The visual board is one of our feedback mechanisms. And then finally, maybe she has there some reports, metrics, and data. That's another form of feedback mechanism. But these are all feedback mechanisms. It's not a feedback loop until you do what? Until you do something about it. You take the active leadership. That closes the feedback loop. So that's the distinction between feedback, which things like a retrospective is feedback. But if you don't do anything, if you don't take action, you have still an open loop. You have not closed the feedback loop. And closing the feedback loop is absolutely critical to having any continuous improvement, any form of improvement. Feedback without action is not a feedback loop. Right? It's just a bitch session. That's what many retrospectives end up turning out to. How often you see it? I held a retrospective and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. People holding retrospectives religiously. Yeah, we do the retrospective every time. Do you do anything about it? Oh, no, that's too much work. Don't know how to do anything about it. You have to, that's what we try to teach and approach is, how do you actually do that? And the approach we use is managed evolutionary change, which is different than biological evolution. Biological evolution is responding to changes in the environment. Managed evolutionary is us instilling a direction we want to take and intentionally manage it. So we're going to manage the things that are hurting us that we want to get better at. And of course, we use the scientific method to do that. Start with some hypothesis, observations really first, a hypothesis from that observation, collect the data, measure it, and then figure out what we want to do. So in the perspective of our process improvement, since we want to start with the pain, we look for where it hurts. Where does it hurt now? We reflect on the problem. Right? From that, then we start exploring solutions. We evaluate the difficulty and the resistance. This was another element that Bjarte brought up, is we're always going to hit a resistance. You've got to figure out how can we overcome that resistance, or how do we deal with that resistance. So we're going to go through this in high step, and then we'll go through it in detail as we each one of these steps. We design the experiment around that. We run the experiment, and we evaluate the fitness. Did this actually give us the results? Is this in the direction we want to take? And if it is, if it's still hurting, we evaluate, does it still hurt? If it does, we want to continue to work on that. Or potentially, it no longer hurts, and we find a new problem. We find the next place that's hurting. Right? And we take this on in a small, iterative steps and get good at this whole cycle, and we find that we can continuously improve quite nicely. So here's an example of it. Our character, Rosie, is talking about what hurt for her team. Okay? So she has a number of different challenges that she's got. She's running a Scrum team right now, and she's looking at, well, where are we having problems? Engineers are pushing work onto the testers, conflicting messages from different team members, lacking feedback. They had 3 that they identified as things that they really wanted to focus on. So constantly set up for failure with goals that are unrealistic. The sprint scope just keep changing on them, and testing was taking way too long. So those are the 3, because this is just an example of how someone might go about it. So they went with these 3 items. And then next step of that is, okay, let's reflect on those problems. So we first selected a few that we want to focus on. Out of that, we filtered it down. And then start looking at where are the problems, right? With those 3, we broke it down a little bit more, did more analysis of the problem. Where are the roots of the problems that we're actually encountering? And so with that, we had a couple of different things with the setup. Maybe the reason that we're failing with goals is poor goal setting. Maybe it's stakeholders making promises before we see them. Anyone have that problem? Yeah, it's or the injection by executives to say you must have it by whenever. So this was an error, but they ended up focusing on these 2 here. The sprint scope keeps changing. And so, well, one of the main problems is too much unplanned work. We see this all the time. That Scrum teams feel like they're overwhelmed because they're getting all this work coming in that's not part of their, they're trying to do all this planning, but then they end up with all this unplanned work that has to be handled at the same time. So yeah, this is a common problem we see in a number of Scrum teams. Testing takes way too long. Often common problems, many times because maybe QA is overloaded, or maybe they have a weak definition of done. Those were the areas where they thought, let's dig down deeper into them. This is just an example to show. You usually often do this as a workshop. We go through and we break this down in more detail with your problems and see where you're at. But this is sort of the dive down deeper, see where you've actually got the problem, before we start looking at what solutions we're going to come in with. One of the things I see as an anti-pattern frequently is Agile coaches thinking, oh, I found this new toy, new practice. I think we should try this new practice. So this is a push. Right? Cool idea, let's do it, as opposed to we actually have a problem, let's go find the problem. Let's go find and look at the problem, and what's the thing that's going to help that problem. Very much along the way Scott's DA works as well, is that here's your problem, let's figure out how we can deal with it. What's the practice and approaches that we've seen in the past that have worked really well in these areas? And so if we can do this and run these small experiments and get really good at it, we can continuously improve. So next we start looking at, well, given that now we understand these problems, what are some of the solutions that might work? So this is where we look at the overall set of practices that we have in the Kanban method. And so these are the 6 general practices of the Kanban method. Visualize, which people are very familiar with, the board. You make things, but it's not just the board. It's also anything. Policies can be visualized. Metrics can be visualized. So all of this, we make things, we unhide information so that decisions can be made. Limiting work in progress. One of the biggest things that we've seen as an immediate process improvement. You start limiting work in progress, things go out the door. You have too much things in progress, you end up with Bangalore traffic, right? And you get some cars off the road, and you can actually go pretty fast. And that's what this is all in support of managing flow. We want to get flow of value through the system. We want to get continuous flow through the value, and we do that through understanding what's happening, managing the system, and using data to help us with that. We make policies explicit. Let's understand what we're actually doing, make it available so everyone, what the agreements are. Things like a definition of a done, for example, that you have in Scrum. This would be something that's a type of policy, multiple types of policies. We established the feedback loops, the feedback mechanisms and the corresponding feedback loops, so the cadences and the feedback information. And as well, improve collaboratively, evolve experimentally, which is the part I'm going through right now. How do we really get good at continuous improvement through feedback and the rest of these practices? These are the general practices, and within there, there's specific practices. So this is available, this body of knowledge is available for them to look at, given we have this problem, what would be some of the appropriate possible solutions we could look at. And you can also look at beyond this, right? But the idea is, here's a set of things that have worked really well. How do we work from there? So in the case of our team here, the Scrum team's ideas, they had a set of problems. These 3 areas, the sprint scope keeps changing, testing taking too long, and they had 2 different parts of testing taking too long. One is the weak definition of done, and QA being overloaded. And they came up with a couple of different ideas. So maybe here, use a WIP limit, a policy on how to handle unplanned work, visualize unplanned work in a swim lane. So some specific things that we have used in the past that people can pull from. Weak definition of done is maybe write a better one or maybe enforce it, right? QA is overloaded. You look at different approaches for that. So with all of these, we're starting to look at where do we go from here? So we're now looking at overall how we improve collaboratively and evolve experimentally. The challenge we're going to hit is that not all these solutions are going to be easy, and also they're not necessarily going to be smooth sailing. They're going to hit resistance in many cases. So what we want to look at is how difficult are they and where's the resistance? So the Kanban method, we talk about being like water. Water flows, it hits rocks, rocks are the resistance. We flow around the rocks. We go around the rocks. So there's an around the rocks concept of how do we go. We don't necessarily, now sometimes we can go right through the rocks. If the rocks are small, we just go through them. But sometimes the rocks are big enough and we have to move around them, or sometimes we have to be water that erodes the rock and eventually moves it out of the way. And this is based on the Bruce Lee philosophy, be like water, my friends. Let me see if this. So let's reflect on that a bit. The water becomes the cup. And so if one thing you're thinking about is your approach, say bring about agility into the organization, agility is the water you're bringing in. You're trying to bring that, and the organization is your cup. And frequently I hear this, right? We can't be agile until we change the culture. And Scott earlier mentioned the 10-year anniversary of the manifesto. We were there. One of the comments I made at the time was Agile needs to adapt to culture as much as culture needs to adapt to Agile. You can't think you're going to get the whole culture to change before you start doing it. You can do things incrementally very well, right? And if you bring about the parts that are appropriate, evolutionary change is all about doing this. Now, we all threw out a whole bunch of things and nothing really stuck, right? And this was one that I had a lot of people saying, what are you talking about, right? Because there was so much investment into, we're culture consultants. We brought in a bunch of people who are culture consultants and we want to fix your culture. But the reality is maybe you fix your culture slowly, not by big bang. So why do we go around the rocks? Because rocks hurt. You keep trying to go into the rocks, you're going to get hit resistance. let's look at that beforehand. Let's understand where we're at. Let's understand our resistance, and maybe we can manage it up front. Let's not be stupid about it. We do so many stupid things. So around the rocks in real life, what does that look like? One approach is under the radar. Right? You're going to make a change, and you know there's potential resistance to the concept, right? I mean, one example is, like I said, I could be giving this whole talk without mentioning Kanban once, because I could talk about evolutionary change. I never have to talk about Kanban. And I'm choosing to talk about Kanban because I believe this helps. But I could also do this whole thing without talking about Kanban once. So many times you're going to bring in a change, and you know there's going to be someone who's adverse to that change. So we've countered that ourselves. We go into places that are, we're a Scrum organization. We don't want that Kanban stuff around here. Well, we can still help, because we can bring evolutionary change to you and help you do better Scrum. So one of the things we talk about with the Kanban method is we're going to make whatever you do better, which is why we've got a new class called Scrum Better with Kanban. It's better with Kanban. Kanban can bring about something that's an improvement to it. And so under the radar is one way. We can do these things without making it hugely visible. So this is a case where normally one of our values is transparency, but there are times where transparency is not the answer. Right? Being under the radar is actually helpful sometimes. Not always, and you have to use it with caution, but it's one of the approaches you have. Another one is break it down into smaller pieces. Right? If you got big rocks, can you break the rocks down into smaller chunks? You break it down into smaller chunks, the resistance is less. And the cost of failure is less. So if you can break it down into smaller chunks, that's a good way to do it. Look for ways to do that. And another one is not necessarily break it down, but run in smaller experiments, right? So you have resistance, but you say, well, would you really be willing to try an experiment? And if it fails, we don't do it. But if it works, we'll do something else, right? And so this is getting buy-in from that person that's resisting to say, okay, can we try something, but we try it in a safe way. And so give them an out, and that's one of the things. So these are 3 different approaches to dealing with resistance. That's not the only 3 ways, but I want to give you examples of what we're talking about when we talk about resistance. So with the idea of being like water, where's the resistance and where are the other challenges you might have? So you might have resistance from people. You want to look at how much, who are they? You might also have technical difficulty. You might want to be doing something, but it's so hard to do it, or implementation difficulty. Does it require iterations to learn and then put something into place? These are just questions you want to be asking about things. And then the other is, do you actually have the autonomy to do it? Or do you have to influence someone else in order to make this change? And if we dive deeper into that, we look at the resistance to the problem. For each one of these, you have people who are going to be disagreeing with you, right? They may not agree that it's a problem, or they may not think it's important. It also could be people are actually benefiting from the current state. So you're going to say, I want to make this change, but there's someone who's actually benefiting from that, and they're going to lose something. So that's another form of resistance. So you got to look at all of these areas of challenges. Again, with the solution, there may be people who are concerned that the solution is going to harm them, or the implementation, the final implementation, may actually harm them. These are all elements of looking at it, and you don't have to be perfect with your forecast of these issues, but you want to at least explore them before you go off challenging into running into the rock. So if we look at this from a perspective, this is something we've come up with as a guidance, is both the resistance and the technical difficulty tend to behave in similar ways. They tend to be challenges. So these are sort of challenges, if you have low challenge or high challenge, and then what's your ability to influence? So do you have a low ability to influence or a high ability to influence? And for those areas where you really don't have the ability to influence, but it might not be that much resistance, you're looking to work with something, partner or assist. I'll give you an example of that in a bit. Maybe I'll give you an example now. When I was leading organizations, I was dealing with HR in terms of performance management, because HR had, we have to have performance management, you have to evaluate all your people. And I didn't like any of the performance approaches that I had seen around. MBO I thought was ridiculous, and anything was based on, but all the systems were based around some sort of objective. Did you meet your objectives? So what I did the first time, I did the under the radar approach to this, which I ran it myself. I had the autonomy to run under the radar, and I turned all my objectives into effectively subjectives. So I looked for behaviors I was looking for, not numeric concepts. And it worked really well. I went under the radar, and I didn't need assistance. The second time, though, the organization I was with wanted something, and the HR department was very supportive of it. So I couldn't make the change myself at the scale we were talking about. We're talking about across an organization. But I could work with HR, and together we were able to make some very significant changes to the performance management approach, which took them away from the MBO approach and went more towards a behavioral guidance. What are the types of things, what are the behaviors we're looking for? So it was a big and a huge success from the satisfaction. The managers loved it, the engineers loved it. And so, by having that partnership, I was able to expand it even further. Because the other things which are hard and we can't really do, we want to defer for now. Things which are easy and not going to have resistance and we have autonomy, these we go straight ahead, and then these other ones we may have to go around the rocks. Right? They're going to have more resistance or difficult. We need to look at it. So in our case here, there were three that stood out. We could rewrite the definition of done. We could expand the workflow to visualize what QA is focusing on. So not just a doing done, but actually the steps in the QA process. We could expand that out. And we could establish a WIP limit of 1 per tester. So these were all things that they felt they could do straight away. Now, they're going to have to, actually enforcing the definition of done may take more work, right? So they acknowledge that was a little bit harder. And implementing automated testing, that's not going to happen overnight, right? We all wish it could, but automated testing can be hard, right? And we can have resistance to that, and we also have a lot of work to do. And then hire more staff, not going to happen, right? The budget says no, right? We heard that today. So here's what they did. So they worked on those three, started looking at that. And their hypothesis was we believe that if they expand the workflow to visualize what QA is working on, rewrite the definition of done after looking into it more, and establish a WIP limit of 1 per tester, that they thought that they could accomplish some significant improvement, that testing was taking too long. Now, in this case, they've got 3 items up here. Right? That may or may not be the right number. Right? What is the challenge if you have too many items going on simultaneously? A couple of challenges. One is not focused. It could be that you have conflicting, you don't know which one of them was actually the good one, perhaps, right? You might have misjudged what's actually working and not working. And you might have, we talk about WIP limits, but maybe we're taking on too much, right? So 3 may be too much. 1 might be the right answer. You got to figure that out. It's contextual based on your situation, what you can take on. Here they're thinking, yeah, we think we could do all of this at the same time and run the experiment. So then you run the experiment, see how that goes, and then evaluate. Did this work? Do we need to roll it back if it's not working for us? Even if the pain is still there, do we want to continue to try something else, right? So maybe we got some improvement in the pain, but it's still there. Maybe we need to do some more, right? These are all just guidances that takes us in the right direction. And if the pain is gone, most likely there's another pain that's lurking behind that. Or maybe even we fix that pain and introduced a new one. That can also happen. We introduce something unintended consequence. These things all happen, right? Not going to be perfect because we can't predict the future. And while we can't predict the future, we at least can use some of the fundamental theory that we've understood from others and use those as guidance. So we're not blindly just poking away at things. We're actually trying to guide from what we know from history and the theory that's underlying it. But we choose a few, we run the experiment, and then that gives us the process control that enables us to continuously improve. And if you get to a final point where you've hit sort of a stagnation where you've gotten to the comfortable place and you think, okay, now I don't need to change anymore. Well, the lesson is you probably have hit a plateau. And there actually is probably a lot more improvement you could make, but then you got to look to history as to where you can make those improvements. And one of the places we bring that about is the Kanban maturity model, because this is a pattern we see. People go through stages where they hit to a satisfactory place, and they stop making bigger changes that could help them organizationally. Right? So they make some team changes, but they don't move up to the next level, to the system level, or to the organization level. And many times those changes can bring about great improvement. And that's an approach. But this is a good one for getting started, and we can apply it through the levels and then take it to the next stage. So with evolutionary change, we're starting with an initial maturity. We're evaluating fitness. We're continuing these experiments, right? Sometimes we roll back. Sometimes we roll forward to some new idea. We keep evaluating these. And the future of our maturity, the future of our process improvement is emergent through these, getting really good at this. So it's evolving. Yeah. So with that, bring it to a bit of a close. We'll have enough time for some questions. If you'd like to find out more about the Kanban method, I highly recommend the official guide to the Kanban method. It brings about a lot more than many people just think, like it's a bunch of stickies on a wall, or it's a framework that I use. It's something that one of the huge misconceptions that I hear, particularly in India, is Kanban Scrum is for projects or products, and Kanban is for operations, and just floors me. I've been using Kanban for products for a long time. I've been in product space. Giving a talk tomorrow about products, and Kanban's a fantastic method for projects, products. Really can be applied to anything. The only part of that that's true is that trying to use Scrum in operations is total stupidity. It just doesn't work. But Kanban's an approach, and because Kanban's an approach you put on top of what you're doing now, that even thought of it is that one is for one and the other is for something else, it's just totally flawed. They're two different animals. Scrum is truly a framework. It's an incomplete framework. Kanban is an approach to build up on what you're doing now. Thank you. So, any questions?
Yeah, hi Todd. It's really good to see you here and then meeting. I've already gone through this Kanban University, and then some of the concepts I've already implemented in my teams while implementing Kanban. One of the challenge I always find or get a pushback from the teams or the leaders as well, that when we implement Kanban, sometimes we lose the predictability and the commitment as well what we have got in Scrum. So leaders feel that team get more relaxed, that whenever they get the bandwidth they can pull, and they don't need to commit at a start of the week or a start of the month that how much items they will be able to finish in certain period of time. So what is your thought on that?
Yeah, so David Anderson's perspective on that is that Scrum is based on Catholicism, this idea of guilt, right? And so commitment in that way is one way. We'll get you to commit, and then therefore you're guilty. You feel guilty if you don't meet that. That's not a very healthy environment, right? Unfortunately. I've never had trouble with that, because I think so the thing is, if you're using commitment as a means of getting focus, it's the wrong tool, I think. Okay. Commitment, you're really trying to get focus and getting people to take professional pride in what they do. And I never had any trouble with teams getting that when I've had an environment that was healthy. Right? Now, if you have an unhealthy environment, I don't know, right? Then you have a challenge with that. But really motivating people around a higher goal, a higher purpose, is often what I've worked towards, right? In making sure that people understood why they were doing what they were doing. And people were professionals, people in our business were professionals. They went to get this profession, and they want to do good work. And then we just create environments that devastate them, right? And put them and treat them like trash, unfortunately. So I appreciate that the challenge, right? And I've seen, I've done a lot of work in India, and I see the challenge that the Indian management structures have taken it to an extreme, right? It's still bad in other places. The Western world still has that same challenge. It just seems to be here. And part of that also probably because a lot of the business structures want to service outsourcing and things like that, where you're looking at billing by the hour and making utilization is super important, right? So these are all considerations. They're all considerations, which means that not all the same practices are going to work under those considerations. So you're going to have to work with that. So this is going to be one of your rocks. Okay? And you got to figure out how big is that rock? And how do I work away at that rock? How do I step in the right direction? And so the challenge, you want to also get to the fundamental challenge. So why are they doing it? They're worried about, are we getting utilization? Are we getting commitment? Are we getting focus? And you have to ask, are there other ways to get that? Because if there are other ways to get that, they can be much healthier. Because then you're treating people like adults rather than like children. So if you can do that, then great. If you can't do that, then you're living within that constraint. Right? And then you have to figure out, are there some approaches to dealing with it? Can we chip away at it? Can we go under the radar? Can we do other things? And
it's a mindset, right? So sometimes leaders or the management layer, they feel that we are unable to focus for a quarter or for a year, right? We don't know how much value or how many features this team can deliver if they opt for Kanban.
So I'll say another thing. One of the coping mechanisms for dealing with that uncertainty and for dealing with that predictability element is the intensive focus into it. One is, let me do a whole bunch of upfront planning, estimating, and therefore that's going to help me in some way get better at predicting. The other one is the way that we approach it typically in the Kanban. We can do either, right? There's nothing wrong with if you are currently planning and doing that and you want to stay with that, great. But in the Kanban, where we evolve to, and where we want to evolve to, is one where rather than focusing on estimating and planning, we want to focus on measurement and history of the system. And if we can get really good at understanding history of the system, we can get really good at predicting. Right? So a lot of times what we see that works is running these experiments, and then we see that while we would say Kanban is not a transformation, it can be hugely transformational. We've seen people that are starting from Scrum, seeing 4x improvement in reduction in lead time and improvement of throughput in 90 days. And I think as Scott said, it's about doing fewer stupid things and more smart things. Right? So WIP limits is usually one of those. Understanding the process flow is one of the others. And then just caring about how things are working through the system. Right? Focus on delivery, focus on getting things through the system. All of those things add up and they make huge improvements. And in the absence of that focus, you just end up with stasis. Right? They had what they called Scrum stall. They'd gotten a little bit of improvement, but not getting any better because they didn't know how to improve. You throw a few small things at it, bringing in approaches from the Kanban method, and you can get huge results. And in many cases, it's about backing away from things that just weren't adding value. Much of the estimating and planning was not adding value. Much of what they were doing about trying to push things through the system was actually not just not adding value, but actually actively hurting the system. So understanding how things are flow, focus on flow can really make a difference. But a lot of that's a leap of faith, right, in terms of understanding, can I get what I think I need to do? Because they've been taught that the only way to get there is by detailed planning. They've been taught to linearize the world, and we're not living in a linear world. We're living in a world of high uncertainty. Even medium uncertainty cannot be planned out.
So Todd, it's Ketan here. I just have a perspective here. I want to have your view about it. You said water being the flow, as Bruce Lee mentioned. It's also about how water comes in from the ice as well, of the rigidity. Mm-hmm. At which environment the ice is going to get melt to become the water to flow till the rocks. Yeah. And it's also about if the rocks is surrounded through the water, it has to uprise to become a vapor so that it can rise up to see how it can be reformed and restructured in the current world of the environment. Do you feel that the environment where from ice melts to water and water gets to vapor is something which is important from the cultural agility of it? Because alone water flowing may not be sufficient.
Yeah, so you're starting to look at the bigger ecosystem, right? So what's happening in the overall ecosystem is something that's important. Now, if you're in the middle of the river, if you're a fish, right, you don't care about the ice melting or the rain. You care about the water you're living in, right? And so sometimes you're the fish, and sometimes you're the park's manipulator. If you're in charge of maintaining the park, then you have to look at the complete ecosystem and what can you do to keep it from eroding, or if it's things happening in the river because people are trampling on things or they're interrupting the species that are native to the area, then that's going to change the environment. And so you're trying to see, what can I do to preserve this space? If you're the fish, you're trying to figure out, well, how do I survive? And how do I flow through this? And if I'm a salmon, how do I get upstream, whatever. So it's all contextual, right? And so the thing you don't want to do going in, I feel like, and this is what we talk about, the Kanban method, taking small incremental steps. We don't want to boil the ocean, right? We want to take small changes that will actually improve our environment and start looking locally first, and then start expanding out from that. Because locally is the places where we're going to have autonomy, more autonomy. Many times we try to go to the rock. The rock itself isn't within our autonomy, right? So sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, right? And so we want to be looking at where can we make some small changes now and start getting better, rather than saying, well, we can't make any change until we fix the whole problem. And so I think that's where we get stuck a lot. In the Agile space, kind of a big problem is this think that I can't change things until you fix, and I can't do anything because my middle manager's in the way, or my executive doesn't support it, or whatever it is. Well, they're part of your system. Start working about it, right? And eventually you might change that. But thinking that you're going to get them to change, I think that's one of the problems we've had with credibility. The Agile coach says, no, you can't be involved in it. You can't make that decision. Try to talk to an executive saying, you can't do that, you have to stay away. Well, that doesn't help your credibility, and they're the ones that are ultimately funding you. You get a little bit of runway, but that runway is gone. You've got to be showing value, you've got to be showing delivery, you've got to be pragmatic, and to do that, you can do that. But you can do that now. You can do that by evolutionary change with small incremental steps. Just get better, a little bit better every day, or every iteration, or however long, just get there, and eventually you'll keep improving.
Got one question for me.
Yeah.
So there's a constant pressure to improve productivity, increase, and all. So what we are suggesting to various companies about the product centric approach, or maybe outcome based models. So now most of them are Scrum development oriented. They see how much well we are doing the release process. Which is giving the end user the benefit. Based on that, we get paid. The companies like us who work for, and so from Kanban University, beyond throughput, then the cycle time and all these things, what they have, the measures, what is that has been prescribed for to have a better productivity in terms of other than the throughput, cycle time, or all these things, or WIP limits and all.
Yeah, so that's looking at it from the output and value perspective has always been one of our biggest challenges, because they're almost, I was in a product company, and so the one thing about a product company is you do get those metrics, but they're lagging metrics, because you don't know how you do until it's out in the market and you're getting feedback from customers. So you want to work on how can I improve that feedback cycle, right? How can I make sure I'm getting the right feedback, and also how can I make sure that I'm getting timely feedback, right? So in many cases that's involving customers. There will be quantitative metrics, which will be, in our case, it was how much money we made from a product. And that's very valuable because that feeds back into the cycle, tells you how much your investments are going to be. But you're also looking for a lot of qualitative, which you can get along the way by involving customers. And we involve everyone in that conversation. We involve our developers. That's one of the things that I think Scrum has done a poor service to, is creating this. Everyone has to go through the product owner. It's good in one sense to keep the distractions, but it's disrupting the full feedback into the technical team. And many times the technical team has great advice on the product. Yeah. So
Evolutionary, we need to actually face This constant need to adopt and evolve and stay ahead. A wonderful session. Thanks audience for coming in and getting involved with Todd to understand more on the evolutionary change that we are going through. Thank you, Todd, once again for making us.
All right, thank you.